And the data I have, I've got data, I had data on something like 10,000 people doing the diet, and I couldn't find a real major outcome difference between those who ate grass-finished beef and grain-finished beef. And I know this upsets people, and I don't really have a sort of a dog in this fight, but I mean, I prefer people to eat grass-finished beef for environmental reasons, and I think I'm happy to make that argument. I think you can make that argument quite strongly. But when it comes to the health argument, I just don't know that we have the data to do that. And I would really hate for people to say, well, I can't afford the diet because I have to eat grass-finished beef and therefore I'm not going to do it, when that's not the case. And so I'd rather see you get healthy, take care of your own health, and then if you have the opportunity, the time, the resources, then you can worry about the environmental side. But it doesn't do us much good to have a bunch of sick people eating their cereals and junk food because they're afraid to eat beef in the grocery store.
Hello my darlings, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Despina, and you can just call me Desi for short. I'm sure you guys know that by now. Welcome back. How's everyone doing? I hope everyone's doing well. Sydney has opened up. We're past our COVID prison lockdown, and I'm very happy. I am back with another video to do with the carnivore diet. A lot of people have been requesting that I interview Dr. Shawn Baker again, so I have delivered, and here we are. In today's video, we're more discussing the benefits of grass-fed versus grain-fed meat. If actually consuming chicken is defeating the purpose of the carnivore diet, we talk about we talk a little bit about censorship and why it's actually real. As you know, I am a huge fan of the carnivore diet. I do know that it will not work for everyone, but I feel the need to actually talk to you guys about it. A study came out from Harvard University which showed some amazing results of 2029 people who tried the carnivore diet, but please read that. It will give you so much clarity. So I'm going to introduce to you again Dr. Shawn Baker, who is founding father of the carnivore diet. Now, this guy looks great for his age, very, very, very strong, and all he eats is meat. So if you guys want to learn something about the carnivore diet, then let's get into this. Please hit the bell button, give me a thumbs up. I love you all so much. All right, Dr. Shawn Baker. I want to start off by saying that I was on Twitter and I was trying to pull up some tweets of yours, but you've been deleted.
I have.
What happened?
Well, I mean, reportedly, they say I had a copyright violation. Apparently, one tweet I did in 2019 and then one about 6 months ago contained some music that was copyrighted. And so they said that constituted multiple copyright strikes, so we're going to suspend your account forever, which I think obviously is
forever.
Well, apparently I said I have a permanent suspension. I can't create new accounts and so on.
That's
so we've got some lawyers looking into that. It's just obviously, I think, a discriminatory enforcement of, it's not like I'm inciting violence and all the stuff that people supposedly get banned for. So I don't know if they're just doing some sort of purge of people they don't like or messages they don't want to have put out there. So we'll see.
Well, I don't know about you, but it would seem that did you watch that documentary on Netflix called The Game Changer?
Yes, I did. I saw that one.
Now, what's your opinion on that? Because for me, that was the most propaganda vegan show that I've ever seen.
Yeah, in fact, I did. I actually did a YouTube critique of that. I spent about an hour talking about and going through point by point. And so I obviously it's very much agenda driven. The data is very much skewed. It's not a very fair balance. I mean, if they were to use a film to say, hey, look, there's some athletes that are thriving on a plant-based diet, that would be fine. But then to put in the to use that as a vehicle to just put all the sort of very much agenda-driven misinformation, misinformation in there, which clearly it is. I mean, that's what it was. And as the executive producer, the producer of the film, James Cameron, who funded the film and produced it, he's an excellent filmmaker, but he has got a tremendous conflict of interest. In fact, he owns the largest, or he's invested in the largest pea protein manufacturing place in North America, and so he's got
Mhm.
it's basically as a sales advertisement for his product. And so it's kind of crazy to see. And we're seeing this throughout throughout everything with all the media pushing these plant-based agenda. It's all in def- deference to these companies that are funding all this stuff and wanting to create these $100 billion markets that we're seeing that on, and probably other things, but that's the least of it at this point.
Can you tell us briefly about who you are and what you do? But I'm assuming the majority of people do know you. So.
Well, I mean, there's at least some people who've kind of seen what I follow, what I've known. So, I mean, just in brief, I'm a physician. I'm an orthopedic surgeon. I was a trauma war surgeon. Went to Afghanistan, served there. I've been a world champion athlete. I at some point got very jaded by the sort of the modern medical system and started to just try to push more lifestyle related stuff, and that didn't go very well with who I was employed with. So we ended up parting our ways. I ended up founding my own company. I partnered with someone. We founded a company that's based on nutrition and lifestyle, and so that's kind of what I've been promoting and pushing for the last about 5 years now, notably on social media. And I've been pushing buttons pretty hard and offending some people and irritating some people and pushing back on the narrative. And like I said, it's definitely been an uphill battle. I think we're still making progress and going forward, but as you've seen, the tactics to censor and drive traffic in a certain direction toward a particular narrative has ramped up into full gear as of the last year, particularly with the COVID stuff. And so I think that sort of standard operating procedure is now going to be applied in many, many other things that, if you don't sort of go along with the particular narratives that benefit these corporations, then you will be, your voice will be silenced, unfortunately, I think.
What are your views on protein powders? Do you think they work, and do you think that it's not a good idea to drink them, or?
Well, I would say that I think protein is a very important component of the diet. I think probably of the macronutrients we have, I think protein is probably the one that I would spend the most focus on. I think most people don't get enough protein. Protein powders are, particularly whey protein is a very good source of protein, particularly the amino acids in there, the bioavailability. It's, if we look at things like the PDCAS, which is concerned with protein availability, it's an excellent source of protein. However, that I think when you take protein and isolate it in a powdered form, you're missing out on so much more of the nutrition. In fact, there are several studies that show that if we're concerned about building muscle, then eating whole foods, particularly things like egg whites versus whole eggs, skim milk versus whole milk, the whole food product tends to be better at building muscle. And I think that arguably we should all be focused on creating and maintaining lean muscle mass. And so there's other issues with powders in general, whether it's protein powder or powdered foods such as flours and sugars and even concentrated fats. That is not how our body was set up to process nutrients. We don't eat, you can't imagine turning anything into powder with your teeth. I mean, if you were just sort of out in the wild and you were eating food, you would not be eating powder unless you spent 12 hours a day, with a mortar and pestle grinding. But most people are, eating some sort of natural food, whether it's a fruit or whether it's an animal or something else you could either easily acquire. You're not going to be eating it in powdered form. And I think part of the problem, and protein is no different, is you get this super high rapid absorption rate of energy that our body's just not accustomed to. And I think we really see the problem when it comes to powdered carbohydrates and concentrated liquid fats, that we overwhelm our capacity to react appropriately with our hormonal system, our incretin hormones, which are part of the gut system, and we end up with problems, whether it's gut problems themselves because their gut it's overwhelmed and we have a lot of GI upset, or we have problems with energy regulation through blood sugar fluctuations and so on and so forth. So I would say, like I said, if you're strapped and you can't, I would much prefer to see you eat some eggs or a steak or something like that. If you're a vegetarian or something like that, at least a whole food plant protein-based source of protein than a protein powder. If you can't do that, I would rather see you get protein than just eat straight up, uh, potato chips and carbohydrates and stuff like that.
Mm,
So it's a lesser evil than some of the other foods, but it's certainly not optimal or ideal.
100%. Now, you're still carnivore, correct?
That's correct.
All right. Now, you said that on your Twitter that your diet consists of 90% sirloin steak. I think that's what you said.
Well, I mean, it's 90% red meat, so it may be
Okay.
sirloin, maybe ribeye, it may be flank steak or something like that. And then the
Okay.
remaining 10% is going to be eggs and seafood and some pork. And
Mm,
every once in a while I'll eat something that's got is plant derived, but it's so incredibly rare that I don't really consider it as a part of the diet. It's I had a piece of birthday cake on one of my kids' birthday 6 months ago. But I mean, for all intents and purposes, I eat a fully meat based diet.
okay. Can you tell us what a real carnivore diet is?
Um, well, I can tell you the intent. I mean, there's going to be people that are going to quibble and argue about this and that, and I tend not to get into that. I basically say, why are you doing the diet in the first place? Well, you should be doing it because you're trying to improve your health, and if you're doing it just for some other reason, I mean, outside of performance, I mean, you can improve performance, which I think is a part of health, but if you're doing it just to say I'm on a carnivore diet, then I think you've lost the point. And so when I give lectures on this, I talk about, obviously we're focusing on animal source foods, whether it's meat or organ meats or eggs or fish or dairy or whatever it might be. So that's the diet. And then, with regard to the stuff that you may have with that, and many people, that's it. That's all they're going to eat. And many people need to do that, at least for a reasonable period of time. And some people continue to do that for many, many years, like myself. But beyond that, I say, you're going to limit the plant material in your diet or completely eliminate it, as necessary. And yeah, for the reason of, improving your health or optimal health outcomes. And so I think those caveats are important. It's as necessary and limit. And a lot of people do this, and I still consider it very valid to call these people, using a carnivore diet as they're 95% meat and they're 5% blueberries or strawberries or something like that. I don't really have a problem with that. Again, at the
Mm,
end of the day, my whole point of doing this is talking about getting you healthier. And, if it helps with sustainability, if it helps with, just enough to keep you on target, then that to me is fine. If you don't have problems with that. Now, there are people that will, they'll say, well, I can eat, because there's some people that are eating some fruit. And so therefore I'm going to do that. And that's the optimal diet. And very often it doesn't work for them. And they end up with, it becomes a slippery slope, or they gain weight, or the problems they had, the digestive problems or the joint problems come right back. And so it's clear that some people can add foods to it. Some people cannot, and it's not for
mm,
me to decide or to determine who's to do that. Now, in fact, one of the things our company is doing is trying to figure out who those people are and what's appropriate for them if they want to stretch out and have a little bit more variety. But at the end of the day, it's about eating a lot of meat. I mean, that's, instead of demonizing meat and making it a condiment or completely avoiding it like so many other people are talking about, it is making meat the critical essential part of your nutrition. And and you should and can get pretty much all your nutritional needs met through a meat-based diet. And I think that works for very well for many people. In fact, I think it's the most powerful dietary intervention you can do. Now, like I said, is it necessary and is it something you need to do for the rest of your life? I would say for most people, no, it's not. But I think we should recognize it for what it is, as a very effective tool.
okay. Well said. Who are some examples of past groups of people who have survived and thrived on a carnivore diet? For example, you have the Maasai people of Africa.
Right. Sure. Yeah. So there's a whole host over the years. I mean, there's probably many we aren't aware of, but I mean, there's several folks. There's a whole group of people that live in these circumpolar regions. So you've got the Inuit, who are probably one of the more famous folks. There's the Nene. There's the Sami reindeer herders up in Finland, and on and on. There's probably 10 or 15 different uh, cultures up in that area that famously have done that forever, and they basically live on reindeer, some, the Inuit obviously includes some marine mammal, and occasionally they'll put some berries in there from time to time, particularly in the late summer when they've got access to them. But for the most part, again, all intents and purposes, they're living on a meat-based diet. Several of the Nilotic African tribes, so these are people who live, kind of the Nile region, including Maasai and some of the, I think the Watusi and the Dinka and some of these other ones, to some capacity were there. Mongolians were famous, back in the time of Genghis Khan, where he swept through and conquered the largest swath of land ever for any empire. He did that on horseback, bringing their food with him, and they lived on basically meat and milk. And then, in South America, the gauchos famously would do that. And, these folks in Argentina and southern Brazil would spend, most of their time eating basically beef. And so there have been many, many examples. And these people were all, for what we could tell, healthy folks. They didn't have high rates of chronic disease. Now, if we go back historically, and it becomes harder to say for sure because we don't have photos and actual modern interviews with the folks. But if we go back historically, we can look at some of the anthropologic evidence, like radioisotopic data, like some of the stuff that Michael Richards at the Max Planck Universe has done, looking at stable radioisotopic data on early modern humans and also some of the Neanderthals that populated those areas, and by those measurements, those people were on a very heavily carnivorous diet. In fact, if you compare their radioisotopic signature to things like wolves, the humans had higher amounts of meat in their diet than the wolves did. And wolves, most people would argue, are pretty carnivorous. And so on and on and on. We've got pretty good evidence of that going on throughout history and throughout the parts of the world. Now the problem is, everybody in Western society is used to what we're used to. I mean, what you saw your parents and maybe your grandparents eat is the only thing you're experiencing. But if I dropped you into rural Mongolia and said, hey, live there for a year, you probably would be pretty cool with eating a meat-based diet, because that's all you have access to. And so it's clearly the historical precedent is there. It's not even, I don't even think, controversial. But I guess some people want to just pretend these people never existed. Or they were, the retort is often, well, the Inuit, their average life expectancy was shorter than the other people. And one of the things, and that's one I'll touch on that because, well, a couple of things. They'll say, well, we can't use early man as an example because they died at 30 or 35 years of age. And while the population average life expectancy was true, it was low, and the whole reason it's low is because of such high infant mortality rates. So what would happen is 1 out of every 2 children would die in childbirth or within the first 5 years of life. And so when half your population dies at birth, even if everybody else lives to 80, your average is only going to be 40. So to say their average is 35 indicates, and they've got fossil records, going back, 50, 70,000 years of people they think were 75, 80 years of age. And so I think that it's unfair to say they only lived a short life when it's not in fact true. And they also had to live in a much more hostile environment than you and I live in. They were, they don't have an air conditioned, or I don't know if you have air conditioning much in Australia, but you didn't have climate control, and you didn't have soft beds to sleep on. You didn't have windows and doors and things like that. They were often sleeping in rough environments and stuff, and did not have access to medicine. If they fell down and broke a leg, there's a good chance of infection, and on and on and on. And so I think they did pretty well for the most part. But the Inuit in particular, they'll talk, well, the Inuit died of something 65. One of the things most people don't know is the Inuit smoke at one of the highest rates in the world. In fact, I think they smoke at a rate of about 70%. And even among their females, 70% smoking rate. You contrast that to what the US is right now. We're at about 14%, so 70%. And they start at about age 8 or 9 is when they start smoking. And so any concerns around heart disease that they may have had, you have to say, well, if they're smoking, 70% of them are smoking, and they're smoking several packs a day since the age of 8, they're you have to consider that.
Yeah, wow, I didn't know that at all. That's insane. All right. Take me through some of the biggest misconceptions of the carnivore diet.
Well, I think some of the misconceptions are, in order to be successful, you have to eat raw meat, or you have to eat a lot of organ meat. Both of those are false. I mean, there's people that do that. But having had the opportunity to observe now literally tens of thousands of people doing it, I see people of all different strategies do extremely well in this diet. So I think at the very least, I would say you can, if you eat plenty of meat, you're going to be fine for the most part. I mean, there's exceptions, and there's some people that do a little better one way or the other, but the belief that you must do it this particular way. Some of the other misconceptions are that you can just eat as much as possible and you'll never gain weight. I think that's also a big misconception. What I will say is it's hard to do that. It's hard to eat so much that you'll gain weight, because meat for many people tends to be filling. Now, I can tell you personally, I can eat enough to get put on body fat if I want to. I mean, I just have to ramp up my food consumption. Yeah. So, I mean, calories are still going to have an impact here. Now, the advantage is that satiety is profoundly impacted. There are some huge advantages with regard to addiction, food addiction, and recovering from that. When you kind of go cold turkey and you don't have the temptation, it's so much easier to stay on the program. Meat is incredibly nourishing, and so I think it's one of the great things about that. It tends to be very easy on the gut. It tends to lower. This is another misconception, which is that meat is inflammatory, or red meat's inflammatory.
That's right. Yeah.
That is something that I found to be the exact opposite. In fact, whenever we look at those inflammatory markers on anybody that's been on a diet for a reasonable period of time, in the first few weeks, a lot of changes can occur. And so it's hard to make assessments then. But after they kind of get on the diet and they've been on it for a few months, we often see, with rare exception, we see their inflammatory markers just plummet. And we see that in the lab data, but we also, more importantly, we see that in the clinical manifestations. A lot of people with achy joints and sore muscles and tendon pain and all those things, it tends to improve and go away dramatically. We see gut inflammation going away. We see skin irritation and inflammation and some of these autoimmune conditions going away. And so the notion that meat is inflammatory is not supported by, I think, real evidence. Now, there are some, again, epidemiological associational studies when you take people that are basically eating a bunch of junk food and notice that they happen to eat meat, but they're eating mostly junk food diet, they have higher levels of inflammation, and then attributing it all solely to the meat is what we're seeing. We see that over and over again. And this is the unfortunate poor science that we are being led by.
Interesting. Okay. What's the best meat to consume? Grass-fed, grain-fed, what kind of meat?
Well, I think the practical answer is the food you like. I mean, it doesn't do me any good to tell you must eat a certain way if you don't like it. And I know there's particularly a lot of sort of debate about grass-fed versus grain-finished, or grain-finished versus grass-finished beef in particular. And what I will say is there certainly are some differences. We can look at them under a microscope and analyze the nutrients and come up with some differences. And most people would argue the differences are in favor of grass-finished beef. Things particularly like conjugated linoleic acid and omega-3 content and some of the vitamins. On the plus side for grain finish, you might say, well, there's a higher monounsaturated fat content, which some people would argue that that's more beneficial. The other thing is the labeling makes it very difficult. Some of the labeling around grass finish is at best misleading, and sometimes it's flat out deceptive. And so I think that, there's not a lot of human data, unfortunately. I've seen some. I mean, Texas A&M did a study about, close to 10 years ago, looking at grass finished versus grain finished beef. And they didn't really find any outcome differences when they looked at sort of things like blood lipids, which, you can argue how valuable that may or may not be. There was a study in Australia that was done looking at grain finished beef, but unfortunately they compared it to kangaroo meat, and they found there was less postprandial or inflammation right after a meal with the kangaroo meat. Again, it's like, well, they're not even the same species, so it's not a really valid comparison in my view. And then we don't even know if postprandial inflammation is really a problem or not. That's it's like exercise. There's inflammation after I exercise. Is that bad? You can say, well, no, maybe it's not bad. And then pretend we care about the planet, because we've got to take care of the people first. The healthcare sector, at least in the United States, is a huge greenhouse gas emitter. Something like 10% of our greenhouse gases come from our healthcare sector. And you contrast that to beef in the United States, which is only 2%. So it's 500% more greenhouse gases coming from healthcare than beef. And we never hear a word about that. You know, it's something that you have to dig in the literature to find this, and it's not being discussed or talked about because these pharmaceutical industries are, you know, basically minting their own money by the sick care system. So it's one of those things that
Mm,
hopefully people will sort of realize that it's better to be healthy in any, you know, in any situation, I think.
that's really true. Chickens that are raised using hormones, if you're consuming those hormones, isn't that kind of like defeating the whole purpose?
Well, okay. So from a health standpoint, so I first of all, I'll say that I don't have as much insight into chicken production as I do into beef because my diet is almost exclusively
Mm,
beef. In fact, I've only had chicken, I think, once in the last 5 years. But
really?
yeah, I rarely, if ever, eat chicken. I'm just not much of a fan of chicken. But and it's interesting, you know, and this is another side. I'll get back to your original question, but you know, in the United States in the 1970s, we maxed out our beef consumption at about 95 pounds or something like it's like 45 kilos, 43 kilos per year per person. And since that time, it has dropped dramatically, about 30 or 40%. But in that time, our meat consumption has stayed steady because chicken has made up and filled that void. And so we're eating far more chicken, far less beef. And we are seeing a greater, you know, negative health outcome with that. Now, whether those are the causative factors or contribute to that is debatable, but certainly it's hard to make the argument that the red meat is causing the problem when we've been eating less and less of that. But as far as, you know, hormones, I will, you know, again, I know in chickens, you know, those animals are brought to slaughter at, you know, 5, 6 weeks of age. So there's a very quick turnover. And so I do think that analytics do play a role, and we have to be aware of that and do things to improve that. But when it's on the beef side, you know, there are, you know, grass finished beef. Some of it doesn't have hormones, some of it might, most of it probably doesn't. There's grain finished beef, some of it's given hormones, some of it isn't. Again, you can't just blanket say one has everything. You know, it depends on the breed of the cattle, the age of the cattle, the location of the cattle, what's exactly on their feed, all these things. But the hormone stuff, you know, with regard to beef, all including all mammals, including you and I, and the cows we eat, and the chickens and pigs and sheep and everything we eat has some hormones in it. You know, those are natural hormones that we produce. So I, as a male, produce testosterone, but I also produce estrogen. You know, I produce less estrogen, hopefully, than you do, and I produce more testosterone than you do. I
Yeah.
mean, this was one of our differences. And so
Yeah.
cows are going to be producing these hormones, both estrogen and testosterone, and it's going to show up in their beef, and it's going to show up in the milk, and it's going to show up in eggs. And so you're going to be exposed to that regardless if it's been implanted or not. And so the numbers on that, though, are so incredibly small. They're in the amounts of something like nanograms per, you know, per 100 grams or something. It's a tiny, tiny amount. And so just to put it into perspective, I saw that, you know, if you were to eat beef from a cow that had a hormone implant, you know, like in numbers maybe not be quite exact here, but like a non-implanted cow is going to produce like 4 nanograms per whatever per 100 grams of estrogen, you know, per 100 grams, and an implanted cow is going to produce like 6 grams. So it's like, you know, 6 grams versus 4 grams. It's a 50% increase, but it's a tiny, tiny amount. And so if I were to eat, you know, grain finished meat that had been implanted with hormones, to get the same amount that I make every day as a man, the amount of estrogen. So like let's say I make, you know, whatever, a gram of estrogen every day. To get that much from cow meat, I would have to eat the equivalent of 27 entire cows every single day. And
Oh,
so
that's insane.
yeah, so I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, I can't eat 27 cows. Even I can't eat 27 cows. I mean, I'd be lucky if I eat 27 cows the rest of my life. You know, I mean, that's probably realistic. I probably might eat a little more than that. But I mean, to put it in perspective, it's such a tiny, tiny amount that it's not worth worrying about with regard to that. Now, there's other things, like I said, there's other things you could say that might be more problematic, but that's not one of them in my view. And then the same thing with antibiotics. You know, antibiotics, again, I know in cattle for sure, and it's probably the same in any other animal. If an animal is given antibiotics, and they're not all given antibiotics, they've kind of gotten away from that for many cases. Um, they cannot have it within like something like 3 weeks of slaughter or something like that. So there's not allowed to have any within their meat themselves. So you're not getting that in the meat. So it's just like if I took an antibiotic for an ear infection, I'd take it, it'd go through my system, it'd be out of my system within a few days or a week or two. So the same thing happens with cattle. And what happens, and there are hefty fines and penalties for ranchers or farmers that do it the wrong way. So if they get caught giving an antibiotic, and then it's slaughtered, say 3 days later, not only they're not going to get paid for that cattle, they're going to get some kind of heavy fine, and they're going to lose the capacity even to use a slaughterhouse perhaps. And so it is in no way their best interest to do that. And so I think those things are, I think there are reasons to maybe discontinue those practices, but it's not because of the quality of food, if that makes sense.
Understood. Okay.